There. So, second installment, commenting on the Lord's Prayer. Last time we went over the two words, our and Father, and from there we derived 9 or rather 10 aspects from Thomas Aquinas' teaching and commenting on the same. Today we'll be really looking at some words from Teresa of Avila and from St. Francis de Sales, two doctors of the church and masters of devotion and prayer. But also, we'll, as a kind of architectonic piece, we'll still use Thomas Aquinas and his enumeration of things because he's so good at doing that. Today we're looking at who art in heaven. Right? Our Father, who art in heaven, this segment. And from that, we know that not only is God our Father, of which we should have some comfort and some confidence and hope, as well as reverence, but He is powerful. He is heavenly. So this helps us because the rest of the prayer, the rest of the Lord's Prayer, is going to be largely petitions, but we're still in the preparatory phases, and this preparation is very, very important. And it seems like it wouldn't be. Sometimes we want to rush through prep to get to something, and we really have to watch out doing that when it comes to prayer, because almost more important than some of the other things is making sure that we have raised our mind to heavenly things. And so a few things that are evoked. One is preparation. Two is God's transcendence. He's heavenly. He's transcendent. But also His immanence, that the true heaven is also interior, that the kingdom of God is within us, that God dwelling in our hearts is like another heaven. And so in some ways we carry the seeds of heaven within us by grace. And so there's something about interiority and also God and His power, and this is all in preparation to actually make our petitions. So those three we find in Aquinas. So let's look at this preparation piece first in order of business, and you'll find that some of this they interpenetrate. So if we talk about recollecting or being prepared, it also sometimes is interior, because we go within ourselves in some way to find God in our hearts and to be with Him there, or we imagine Jesus, say, in heaven looking at us, and so either way you can think of God as everywhere, omnipresent, or interior, present within, or present in heaven looking upon us with all power. Any of these ways, we're placing ourselves before our Lord, and it makes the prayer a little bit more real. We remember who we're talking to. Where your treasure is, there also is your heart. It's appropriate to do this at the beginning. Matthew 6:21. Aquinas looks at this and quotes it. Our conversation is in heaven. Philippians 3:20. This is another one where we look to we're recollecting ourselves and remembering that we should be thinking about heavenly things and setting our treasure there. Teresa of Avila and her The Way of Perfection, she has this huge commentary on the Lord's Prayer where she tries to really just teach her nuns how to pray. So it's a great guide to prayer. She says, "Consider now what your master says, who art in heaven. Do you suppose it matters little what heaven is and where you must seek your most holy Father? I assure you that for minds which wonder, it is of great importance not only to have a right belief about this, but to try to learn it by experience. For it is one of the best ways of concentrating the mind and effecting recollection in the soul." She uses the word recollection. It's called recollection because the soul collects together all the faculties and enters within itself to be with its God, all its faculties. Its divine master comes more speedily to teach it and to grant it higher levels of prayer, right? To kind of sum up. Now, this recollection, she's talking about taking all of one's faculties and kind of withdrawing from the regular mode which we use for our minds and our ears and everything else, and trying to be really with God. She takes a good deal of time on this. She said, and it's worth us chewing on because it's just solid stuff Francis de Sales talks a lot about it too, and how important it is. And I think rarely is it the case in spirituality where you hear something that says, if you start doing these steps, you'll see effects pretty quick, within days, and you'll really see progress in your spirituality over the course of 6 months to a year. Doctors of the Church giving us even timelines, very rare. All right, so this is what she says. It may not be evident at first if the recollection is not very profound. For at this stage, then, there's like beginning stage, it is sometimes more so and sometimes less. At first it may cause a good deal of trouble, for the body insists on its rights, not understanding that if it refuses to admit defeat, it is, as it were, cutting off its own head. Right? So the body wants what it wants. It wants food, it wants rest, it wants entertainments for the eyes, it wants stimulation. And if it's used to it, if it's already disposed to it, say because I'm scrolling on Facebook or I'm looking at Netflix, it's hard to recollect because the body is tending toward what it wants and what it understands. It doesn't understand this higher level prayer. And so it's not even helping itself out because there's an overflow in prayer, and it's good for the body too. And why is it that the body has its own drive like this? Well, it's largely mismanaged because of original sin. This is the teaching that those who, even though we might have been in baptism washed from the stain of original sin, still its effects are with us so that we can battle those effects of concupiscence. Concupiscence is this power, this desire for pleasure, not in itself bad. It's just bad because it's not regulated properly. In the garden, the teaching is that we would have had a grace of integration, that we would have been in the garden, gardening the garden, and God would have been with us, gardening us. And yet now, since we rejected Him, we're overgrown. One of the effects of loss of the appropriate relationship that we had with our Creator from the very beginning is that the body insists on its rights. And so there's a law within our members that is at war with the law of and the desires of the Spirit, which is really just God, the good, the true, and the beautiful, not this one individual good thing or this one individual beautiful thing. That's what the body understands. The mind can abstract to higher level and transcendent things, and so it requires a withdrawal. All right, if we cultivate the habit of recollecting ourselves, make the necessary effort and practice the exercises for several days, the benefits will reveal themselves. And when we begin to pray, we shall realize that the bees are coming to the hive and entering it to make the honey, and all without any effort of ours. The bees being our faculties. They buzz about, but now they're going into the hive. They go within, and they're making the honey. They're deriving the benefit of prayer without a whole lot from us anymore. It doesn't require as much effort. There's a better habit starting to form of recollection, and it only takes a few days to start seeing the benefits, right? To practice these exercises for several days, the benefits will reveal themselves. It is the Lord's will that, in return for the time which their efforts have cost them, the soul and the will should be given this power over the senses. They will only have to make a sign to show that they wish to enter into recollection, and the senses will obey and allow themselves to be recollected. So, not totally and perfectly, but much more notably, that God is giving a kind of reward of grace, a kind of new integration for the efforts that we put forward. St. Francis de Sales talks about how important this is too. He says, begin all prayer, whether mental or vocal, by an act of the presence of God. This is recollection, right? To place yourself in the presence of God. See, he says, if you observe this, rule strictly, you will soon see how useful it is. This is from his introduction to the devout life. Teresa of Avila confesses that further on that she didn't really enjoy prayer, didn't realize its satisfactions until she really got this down. For my part, I must confess that until the Lord taught me this method, I never knew what it was to get satisfaction and comfort out of prayer. And it is because I have always gained such great benefits from this custom of interior recollection that I have written about it at such great length. So we spend a little more time on it now. We say, Our Father, who art in heaven, and it's great preparation because it helps us to recollect. And very quickly it starts to raise our ability to pray. We make progress in our spiritual life more here than in many other places. She exhorts her nuns further. If she can, that is, any kind of nun, let her practice recollection many times daily. If not, let her do so occasionally. As she grows accustomed to it, she will feel its benefits, either sooner or later. Once the Lord has granted it to her, she would not exchange it for any treasure. Nothing, sisters, can be learned without a little trouble. So do, for the love of God, look upon any care which you take about this as well spent. I know that with God's help, if you practice it for a year or perhaps for only 6 months, you will be successful in attaining it, a habit of recollection. Think what a short time that is for acquiring so great a benefit, for you will be laying a good foundation so that if the Lord desires to raise you up to achieve great things, he will find you ready because you will be close to himself. So what she's saying here is that you can actively recollect yourself, really try to make the efforts, but and you'll see effects pretty immediately, very soon. Frances de Sales, and she says the same thing. But then if you continue to practice it habitually for a longer period of time, 6 months, a year, then it starts to become more and more infused. God starts lifting you into this, and the relationship becomes all the more tangible. So that's the kind of preparatory piece. Two other aspects that Aquinas talks about, right, is that there's the divine immanence, that God is closer to us than we are to ourselves, and this is evoked in the reference to heaven, and also divine transcendence, is omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence. God abides in us in faith, in charity, and the keeping of his commandments. Christ may dwell in us by faith in your hearts, Ephesians 3:17. He that abideth in charity abideth in God, and God in him, 1 John 4:16. If anyone love me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him, John 14:23. So faith, charity, keeping the commandments and the precepts, these are ways that God kind of dwells within us. Again, Teresa of Avila, however quietly we speak, he is so near that he will hear us. We need no wings to go in search of him, but have only to find a place where we can be alone and look upon him present within us. And then she exhorts too, right? Because this is our Father, but he's also omnipotent. He's transcendent. She says, avoid being bashful with God, as some people are in the belief that they are being humble. It would not be humility on your part if the king were to do you a favor and you refuse to accept it. But you would be showing humility by taking it and being pleased with it, yet realizing how far you are from deserving it. And so this is a good segue into God's transcendence and omnipotence. It says, if he were to speak to me and beg me to ask for what I wanted, and I were so humble, right, that I preferred to remain poor and even let him go away so that he would see I had no sufficient resolution. I have nothing to do with that kind of humility, daughters, but speak with him as with a father, a brother, a lord, and a spouse. And sometimes in one way and then sometimes in another, he will teach you what you must do to please him. She exhorts us to be bold, even if humble. That true humility will ask of God's omnipotence things that only he could give. So, by way of summary, what's a good method of recollecting oneself? And you can see this divine immanence and divine transcendence both coming into play in St. Francis de Sales in his Introduction to the Devout Life. He gives us 4 methods. One is to realize God's presence everywhere. Take a few moments and you think about God's presence everywhere, his omnipresence, right? Another, as evidence, you think about him within oneself. You just take a few moments and you realize the fact that he's closer to you than you are, that he's holding your very being in existence by an act of his own will. Third way is you think about our Lord resurrected in heaven in a throne, looking upon us, in some ways in very truth, because he is watching us and is closer to those who pray. He's hearkening, he's listening. You imagine God looking at you. Not just God, but Jesus incarnate and resurrected. This is Francis de Sales one of his methods, his third method. And the fourth method is you can picture him in his humanity, in sacred humanity, just with using the imagination. He's sitting in a chair. I have known of some people who would do this. They'd have an empty chair, and they would speak to Jesus as if he was there. It's almost like an extension of using an icon, but it's like an empty icon in a way. So he says, make use of one or other of these methods for placing yourself in the presence of God before you begin to pray. And do not try to use them all at once, but take one at a time, and that briefly and simply. How briefly? Well, this is a question that I've had, and I've wondered at it. If you're really trying to enter into a prayer deeply, normally, if you were to rattle off the Lord's Prayer, it's a certain amount of time. It doesn't take very long. But if you really wanted to recollect yourself, imagining any one or some of these methods that Francis Sales gives, God's presence everywhere, his presence within ourselves, his presence in his humanity in heaven looking upon us, or present with us and through the imagination. If you were to use one of these ways of trying to rouse yourself to God's presence, how long should you do that before you move on to the next thing? And St. Ignatius of Loyola gives pretty good advice on this, actually. In his preparatory stages for any kind of prayer, he says to do so for about the space of an Our Father. So about that long, about how long it would take just to recite it. In other words, if you're going to say the Our Father, truly recollect it, the very beginning part, it would be a good thing to spend that time in preparation, just in the section, Our Father, who art in heaven, who art in heaven. Take a few moments there and go the rest of the way. St. Teresa of Avila, last quote from her. For love of the Lord, then, sisters, accustom yourself to saying the Lord's Prayer in this recollected way. And before long you will see how you gain by doing so. It is a method of prayer which establishes habits that prevent the soul from going astray and the faculties from becoming restless. This you will find out in time. I only beg you to test it, even at the cost of a little trouble, which always results when we try to form a new habit. I assure you, however, that before long you will have the great comfort of finding it unnecessary to tire yourselves with seeking this Holy Father to whom you pray, for you will discover him within you. See you next time.